Sometime during the Civil War, a black woman walked into the private residence of the President of the Confederate States of America. She said she was looking for washing work. Someone led her through the house, and at some point she was left alone near a private office, and she did what she had come to do. She opened drawers, she went through papers, she read what was on the desk of the man leading a war to keep 4 million people, including her, in slavery. And then the President of the Confederacy walked in and found her there. He asked her what she was doing. She gave him an answer, and he let her go. Because when Jefferson Davis looked at the woman standing in his office going through his papers, he did not see a spy. He saw a black woman looking for laundry to wash, and he could not make his mind hold both of those things at once. So he chose the one that let him keep believing the world was arranged the way he needed it to be. He waved her out. She carried what she had seen back into a network that was feeding the secrets of the Confederate capital straight to the Union Army. For 100 years, America told a version of this woman's story. It gave her a photographic memory, a fake name, a secret diary, a plot to burn the mansion down, and a dramatic escape. It even gave her a face, a photograph printed in books and hung in exhibits. Almost all of it was invented. Even the photograph was the wrong woman. The real person underneath the legend was more impressive than the myth, and harder to pin down, because she spent her whole life refusing to be any one fixed thing. She was born a slave and educated in the North. She crossed the Atlantic to Africa and came back. She was jailed in Richmond for the crime of claiming to be free. She used at least 6 names. She spied inside the Confederate capital, and then the moment the war ended, she walked into the ruins and started teaching people to read. Her name, the one she was born closest to, was Mary Jane Richards. Welcome to Behind the Throne. Here is the first hard truth about her, and it sets the tone for everything. We cannot be certain when she was born. No birth record survives. No document names her parents beyond dispute. Her birth year has to be reconstructed from a ship's manifest years later that lists her age, which points to around 1840 or 1841, probably in or near Richmond, Virginia. The first solid trace of her is a church record. On the 17th of May, 1846, St. John's Episcopal Church in Richmond recorded the baptism of a child named Mary Jane, described as a coloured child belonging to Mrs. Vanloo. She was perhaps 5 years old, and that single line contains the whole contradiction of her early life, because in the same breath the church recorded her Christian baptism and another human being's legal claim to own her. This was St. John's, the same Richmond church where, decades earlier, Patrick Henry had stood up and demanded liberty or death. A child was baptised there as somebody's property. Mrs. Vanloo was Eliza Vanloo, widow of a wealthy Richmond hardware merchant, mistress of a large mansion in the fashionable Churchill neighbourhood. By 1850, her household held as many as 21 enslaved people. But the Vanloo family's relationship to slavery was tangled in a way that matters to this story. Eliza's daughter, Elizabeth Vanloo, privately despised the institution, and the family allowed some of the people they legally owned to live with unusual independence, and may have quietly freed several of them. That left Mary in a strange and dangerous in-between. She may have been free in practice, while lacking the papers to prove it in a court, and that gap was not a technicality. That gap could decide whether she walked down a Richmond street as a free woman or got thrown in a cell, whether she was treated as a student, a servant, or property to be sold. Her freedom, whatever it amounted to, existed at the pleasure of the white family that had baptized and claimed her. What the Vanloos gave her was extraordinary for a black girl in Virginia. They taught her to read, and then they sent her north for a real education, probably in New Jersey, possibly Philadelphia. The old story that she attended a Quaker school has been repeated for years, but there's no reliable evidence for it, and the Vanloos were Episcopalians, not Quakers. What's certain is that she got a serious education, and in Virginia, that was close to a radical act, because teaching enslaved people to read was treated as a threat to the entire system. A person who could read could study a map, could understand a written pass, could recognize a name, a number, a set of orders on a page, could write a letter no enslaver was supervising, could hold the language of American liberty up against the reality of American slavery and see the gap for exactly what it was. Her education would later be described as a gift from Elizabeth Vanloo. That's true as far as it goes, but once it was in her, it was hers. She learned to speak differently to different audiences. She learned when to show what she knew and when to hide it. She learned that the role white authority assigned to her, ignorant servant, harmless black girl, could be picked up and put down like a costume. Those skills would end up mattering far more than any invented photographic memory ever could. But Elizabeth Vanloo had not educated her to set her loose into an independent American life. The plan was to send her to Africa. The American Colonization Society had been founded in 1816 on an idea that sounded like freedom and functioned like exile, that free black Americans should leave the United States and resettle in West Africa, in the colony that became Liberia. Its membership was a strange coalition: enslavers who wanted free black people gone, white reformers who had decided racial equality was impossible, so black people should simply leave, and some black Americans who genuinely believed an African republic might offer what America never would. The movement talked about liberty while assuming black people did not belong in the country of their birth. Elizabeth Vanloo supported it, and Mary was going to be part of it. On Christmas Eve of 1855, at around 14 years old, Mary boarded a ship near Sandy Hook, New Jersey, with more than 50 other black emigrants and a white missionary couple, bound for Monrovia, the capital of Liberia. She crossed an ocean at an age when most children never left their own county. She hated it. Liberia was hard. It had been built by black American settlers on land that already belonged to African peoples, and it was burdened by disease, scarcity, political tension, and conflict between the settlers and the people whose land it was. New arrivals suffered. Mary wrote back to the Vanloos, telling them she was unhappy, and eventually Elizabeth and her mother arranged with the Colonization Society to pay for her passage home. Think about what that decision actually was. Mary had been sent abroad as the living proof of a movement's central claim, that Africa, not America, was the true home for free black people. And she looked at it and she said no. And she came back. She rejected the entire premise she'd been raised to embody. She was going home to the United States, to Virginia, to the country that enslaved her, because she had decided that was where her life was. Coming home was not safe. Virginia law barred free black people who had left the state for an education from returning. A free person who came back illegally could be arrested and in some circumstances sold into slavery. Mary knew that returning to Richmond would put her status under a microscope. She came back anyway. In March of 1860, she landed in Baltimore and made her way south. 5 months later, the danger came true. In August, Richmond authorities arrested a young black woman for walking the city without free papers. She first gave her name as Mary Jane Henley. Then she said Mary Jones. Finally, the officials pinned her down as Mary J. Richards. The newspapers were fascinated. Here was a highly educated young black woman who had studied in the North, sailed to Liberia, and come back to Virginia, insisting she was free. One Richmond paper called the case strange. The law genuinely did not know what to do with her, because everything about her, the education, the travel, the composure, refused to fit the box white Richmond kept for a black woman. But the legal question underneath the fascination was brutally simple. Did someone own her? If she insisted she was free, she could be punished for entering Virginia illegally. If Eliza Vanloo claimed her as enslaved property, she'd be released back into the household. Eliza chose the second path. Mary spent 9 days in jail. Then she was handed back to the Vanloos, and Eliza paid a $10 fine for letting an enslaved woman move around the city on her own. Sit with what that meant. To protect Mary from being punished as a free black woman, they had to publicly declare her a slave. Freedom and bondage had become things she could assert or hide, depending on which one kept her alive that day. She had already used 3 names. She was learning that in her life, holding still was the most dangerous thing she could do, that a name was a tool, an identity was a door, and survival meant knowing which one to open. In April of 1861, St. John's Church recorded a marriage, Wilson Bowser and a woman listed only as Mary, both described as servants of Mrs. Vanloo. The bride was almost certainly Mary Jane Richards. Almost nothing is known about Wilson Bowser or their marriage. No letters, no record of children, no clear account of how long it lasted. But that marriage left one enormous mark on history, because it is where the surname Bowser came from. Mary herself doesn't seem to have used it much afterward. But a Vanloo child would remember it decades later, and from that half-remembered name, the legend of Mary Elizabeth Bowser would eventually grow. The timing of the wedding could not have been sharper. The day after it, Virginia's convention voted to leave the United States. The war had already begun. Confederate guns had fired on Fort Sumter days earlier. Lincoln had called for troops, and now Virginia threw in with the Confederacy. And Richmond became the Confederate capital. Jefferson Davis and his government moved into the city. Its departments and arsenals and prisons and supply offices spread through the streets Mary had grown up in. The town she knew became the beating heart of a nation founded to keep her enslaved. For Mary, the war created a contradiction sharper than anyone around her faced. The government now ruling her city existed to preserve the exact system that classified her as property. To work against it was not a political opinion, it was self-defense. Elizabeth Vanloo chose the Union, openly enough that Richmond came to call her Crazy Bet, a reputation for eccentricity she cultivated on purpose, because a woman thought to be harmlessly insane drew less suspicion. But Elizabeth had protections Mary never would. She was wealthy, white, and from a respected family. She could walk into government offices, talk her way past officials, visit prisoners, and pass the whole thing off as female Christian charity. Mary had none of that armour. Being black made her far more vulnerable if she was caught, but it also made her nearly invisible in exactly the places that mattered, because Confederate society had built itself on the assumption that black servants understood nothing, noticed nothing, and wanted nothing. And that assumption was the crack the entire Richmond underground pried open. The Confederacy was terrified of a slave uprising, and at the very same time, it depended completely on black labour, in its homes, its offices, its hospitals, its prisons, its railroads. Enslaved and free black people moved constantly through spaces thick with information. They carried meals into rooms where officers talked carelessly. They drove the carriages. They cleaned the offices. They overheard the names and watched the troop movements, and were never once suspected, because to suspect them, the Confederates would have had to admit that black people were paying attention. Mary knew precisely how to use that blindness. It was the same trick that had let her slip in and out of identities her whole life, now turned into a weapon of war. The Vanloo network began by helping Union prisoners. Thousands of captured Federal soldiers were held in Richmond, many in Libby Prison, a converted tobacco warehouse near the James River that became infamous for hunger, disease, and overcrowding. Elizabeth got permission to visit by presenting herself as a benevolent Christian woman, bringing food and medicine and books. Behind that cover, the network carried messages, gathered information on prisoners, bribed guards, and quietly supported escapes. Mary was part of this work. One post-war account of her own speeches described her and an unnamed white woman, almost certainly Elizabeth, communicating with Union prisoners and helping escape efforts. The exact details are hard to reconstruct, and that is not an accident. Spy networks don't keep membership lists. People doing espionage destroy the evidence rather than create it. Names get left out on purpose, and credit, when it survives, tends to attach to the person who wrote the report, which is why Elizabeth Vanloo, who left a detailed diary and stacks of correspondence, sits at the centre of the record, while Mary, whose wartime writings did not survive, appears only in fragments around the edges. That imbalance in the archive is not a measure of who mattered. It's a measure of who could afford to leave a paper trail. Vanloo's own diary admits where the good information came from. In 1864, she wrote that her first question every morning, before she was even out of bed, was to ask a servant, "What news, Mary?" And the news, she wrote, generally came. She added that the most reliable intelligence the network gathered came from black informants, whose wisdom and caution and judgment she found remarkable. Even that praise carried the prejudice of the era buried inside it. Elizabeth sounded faintly surprised that black people possessed qualities slavery had trained white society never to see. Mary needed no such discovery. She had always known what she and the other black people of Richmond could do. By 1862, Jefferson Davis had put Richmond under martial law. Suspected Unionists were arrested. Movement was watched. Informers were everywhere. Elizabeth could no longer move as freely, so the underground adapted into something more sophisticated. A relay running from Richmond's hidden Unionists out to the federal commanders beyond the Confederate lines. Messages went out in cipher and invisible ink, hidden in the soles of shoes and sewn into clothing carried by couriers along farm roads and country lanes. Information flowed from servants and clerks and railroad men and prisoners and government workers into the Vanloo house, and then outwards toward the Union Army. It was interracial because it had to be. Different people could enter different rooms. A respectable white woman's charity opened one door. A black labourer's assumed invisibility opened another. A farmer moved a message past the pickets. A railroad worker counted the men and the supplies. There was no lone genius at the centre of it. There was a chain, and every link was mortal, and breaking any one of them could expose all the rest. Mary's place in that chain was among the most dangerous. If the Confederates uncovered Elizabeth's disloyalty, a wealthy white woman might face prison. If they uncovered Mary's, the punishment would be swift and far less restrained. Imprisonment, sale, the lash, or worse. And it's in the middle of this, in February of 1863, that the record shows Richmond issuing free-person papers to a Mary Jane Henley, one of the aliases she'd used at her arrest. In one document she was enslaved, in another free, in a third a servant, in a fourth an unknown woman looking for work. She could read every one of the papers that defined those categories, and experience had taught her never to trust a single one of them. By the winter of 1863 and 64, the network had established direct contact with the United States government. Intelligence from Richmond was reaching Union General Benjamin Butler, and later General Ulysses S. Grant himself, as his armies closed in around Petersburg and the Confederate capital. The reports carried troop movements, defences, supplies, and the growing weakness inside the city. Mary operated somewhere within that expanding system, which brings us back to the house and to the single most famous claim about her, that she spied inside the home of Jefferson Davis. And here the evidence is better than you might expect, because the strongest source for it is not the legend, and not Elizabeth Vanloo, and not a military report. It's Mary herself. After the war, speaking before a black audience in New York, Mary described entering the Confederate president's house while he was away. She presented herself as a woman looking for washing work. Someone led her inside toward a private office. She opened drawers and went through papers. And then Davis came back unexpectedly and found her and asked what she was doing, and by the newspaper account of her speech, let her leave, because he took her for nothing more than a black woman. That account is the true seed the whole legend grew from, and the difference between the two is the difference between a real spy and a comic book one. Mary did enter the Confederate executive mansion. She did go through papers in a private office. She did exploit, deliberately and successfully, the assumptions Davis and men like him made about black women. But her own account described a single entry, under a laundry pretext, Not years of steady employment as a planted household servant. Decades later, memory and retelling stretched that one operation into a permanent placement. Searching papers became photographic memorization of documents off Davis's desk. Improvisation became a flawless standing cover identity. A woman who used many names became the invented Ellen Bond. And in a way, the real version is the more impressive one. Mary did not stroll into that mansion behind a perfect disguise built in advance. She walked into the most dangerous house in the Confederacy with a thin excuse and adapted on her feet. She reached a private office. She searched fast enough to gather something. And when the President of the Confederacy caught her standing in his own study, she talked her way out through her manner, or her explanation, or simply by letting his own contempt do the work for her. Then she carried what she'd learned back into the underground. She didn't need a theatrical costume. The Confederacy had already disguised her by refusing to believe a black woman could be a threat. Her post-war speeches credited her with more than the Davis House. She claimed to have slipped into the Confederate Senate while it met in secret session. She described helping capture Confederate officers and contraband tobacco near Fredericksburg. She spoke of aiding imprisoned Union soldiers. Some of it can't be independently confirmed, and Mary herself changed details depending on who she was speaking to, which has frustrated historians for a century. But that shifting was not the same as lying. 19th century speakers shaped their accounts to their purpose and their audience, and Mary had reasons beyond most. People who had helped the Union were still in danger after the war, from vengeful white neighbours, and naming specifics could expose agents and relatives who had survived only by staying unnamed. Her changing details may reflect performance. They may also reflect tradecraft that simply never turned off. Strip it all down, and the verified foundation stands on its own. She belonged to the Vanloo household. She was educated and literate. She was part of Richmond's pro-union underground. Vanloo's own diary names intelligence brought by Mary. A post-war report records Mary's own account of entering Davis's home and going through his papers. And Richmond reporting from 1900, a full decade before the famous legend was printed, already described an unusually intelligent black maid, educated by the Vanloos and sent to Liberia, placed inside the Davis household. The exact length and shape of her access will probably never be certain. Her participation is not in doubt. She is one of many black Richmonders who broke the Confederacy from inside its own capital, and most of their names are gone, hidden by secrecy during the war and erased by racism after it. They passed information, fed prisoners, supported escapes, and reported the mood of a starving city while Grant's noose tightened. In February of 1864, more than 100 Union officers escaped from Libby Prison through a tunnel in one of the most famous prison breaks of the war, and Mary's own later account tied her and Elizabeth to prisoner contact and escape work. How directly she touched the tunnel escape can't be established. But you don't need the exact thread to understand her world. A place where every package into a prison was searched, every careless conversation could be overheard, every black person moving without papers could be stopped, and every white unionist could be denounced by a neighbour. That was the daily air she breathed for years. In November of 1864, a newspaper advertised Wilson Bowser as a runaway. He'd apparently escaped. By the end of that year, Mary too had left Richmond, and no surviving document explains whether they went together, had already parted, or whether the marriage was even still intact. Afterward, she went back to Richards, not Bowser. The city she left behind was dying, Grant grinding at Petersburg, the supply lines failing, the population hungry and afraid. Elizabeth stayed and kept gathering intelligence to the end. Mary's leaving wasn't the end of her commitment. She was waiting for a different kind of work, and it was coming fast. On the 2nd of April, 1865, the Confederate government fled Richmond. Officials burned their documents and abandoned their offices. Fires spread as the retreating army torched warehouses and bridges, and much of the city centre went up in flame. The next morning, United States troops marched into the Confederate capital, and enslaved people walked out into streets where the government that had claimed to own them had simply vanished overnight. Mary came back almost immediately, and within days she was teaching. The turn is almost too fast to absorb. During the war, her literacy had made her valuable as a secret agent. Now that same literacy made her essential to freedom itself. Formerly enslaved adults and children packed into schools thrown together in churches, homes, army buildings and abandoned rooms. Students came after a full day's labour. Some had waited their entire lives to hold a book. Parents who couldn't read a word brought children they were determined would learn. This was not Mary retreating from the fight into something gentle. Teaching was another blow against the exact world the Confederacy had died defending. Slavery had banned black literacy precisely because reading made people harder to control. A Freed People's School was a daily declaration that black minds belonged to black people. She taught at the First African Baptist Church and at Ebenezer Baptist Church in the summer of 1865, working with Northern aid groups and the new Freedmen's Bureau. And the work frustrated her almost at once, not the students, but the white reformers running the machinery around them. They tended to arrive from the north, certain they already understood what freed people needed. They controlled the salaries, the books, the appointments, the money. Black teachers could be paid less, handed fewer supplies, or placed under white supervisors, despite knowing the community far better than any outsider. Mary had helped bring down the Confederacy. She was not about to swallow condescension from the side that won. By the end of the summer, she left Richmond. In September, she surfaced in New York on lecture platforms, and she did it under new names. Richmond Richards at a church in Harlem, Richmond R. St. Pierre at an AME church in Brooklyn. The aliases may have protected her, and they also let her build a public identity on her own terms, unshackled from the name once written in a slaveholder's household records. She stood before northern audiences as an educated black woman who had crossed to Africa, survived the Confederate capital, aided prisoners, gathered intelligence, and now taught the freed. One black newspaper called her sarcastic and funny. A white Brooklyn paper compared her speaking to Anna Dickinson, one of the most famous lecturers of the age. But she did not simply thrill audiences with spy stories. She turned on the country that claimed to have freed her people. She described Union soldiers harassing black residents after Richmond fell. She attacked the discrimination inside the very organizations built to help the freed people. She argued that emancipation by itself was not enough, that black Americans needed justice, equal treatment, education, and the vote. And she turned on her own audiences too, criticizing black listeners she thought were too worried about fashion and status, and not enough about education and collective advancement. The woman on that stage was nobody's obedient servant. She was sharp, demanding, politically fierce, and willing to indict almost everyone in the room. This is the exact point where the real Mary and the legend split for good. The legend ends when the secret papers reach the Union. Mary's fight didn't. For her, the fall of the Confederacy removed slavery's government. It did not remove white supremacy, and she said so out loud. And then she went and spent years doing something about it. After New York, she travelled through Virginia, Florida, and Georgia, teaching newly freed students, changing names as she went, working through organizations whose paperwork barely kept up with her. By early 1867, she reached St. Mary's, Georgia, a small coastal town near the Florida line, less than 2 years after the war. The Confederacy was gone, but the order that had sustained it was very much alive. Former enslavers fought black education. Violence spread through the countryside, And black teachers and their schools became targets precisely because the school was permanent. It meant the change was real, and it wasn't leaving. Mary built a school there, almost single-handed. She taught around 70 children by day, about a dozen adults at night, and as many as 100 on Sundays. One woman trying to reach nearly 200 learners across a week. Books were scarce. The Freedmen's Bureau's salary she'd been promised didn't reliably arrive. Northern donations came and went. The local black community had almost nothing, because slavery had stolen generations of their wages. And still the students kept coming because they understood that reading wasn't a classroom nicety. It let a person examine a labour contract before signing it. It let a parent search a government list for a relative sold away. It let a voter follow a political debate and recognise whether a document protected him or cheated him. Literacy was independence, and everyone in that room knew it, which is exactly why white men in the town hated the school. In her letters to the Freedmen's Bureau official overseeing education in Georgia, Mary described the atmosphere closing in around her, the barely controlled bitterness in the faces of local white men, the sense that with enough liquor and the encouragement of secret organizations, they were capable of anything. She asked for law. She asked for protection. The woman who had once moved like a ghost through Confederate Richmond was now standing in the open, teaching black children in a town where white supremacy was reorganizing itself into the thing it would become. During the war, the Danger had worn a uniform and searched for spies. During Reconstruction, it wore ordinary clothes and gathered at night. She kept teaching through it. Her letters from these years show exhaustion, anger, and iron persistence, and they show how little the institutions actually backed their black teachers. Northern groups celebrated the mission and left the teachers unpaid. Federal officials promised salaries and lost the paperwork. White administrators questioned black teachers' competence, while depending on them to reach communities no white teacher could. Mary had survived slavery, jail, an ocean crossing, and wartime espionage, and now she had to fight for wages she'd already earned. Her own history in these years kept shifting in the telling. When she met the famous author Harriet Beecher Stowe and a Freedmen's Bureau official in 1867, she gave an account of her life, and, as in her New York speeches, some details differed from other versions she'd given. At various times she said she didn't know her parents, that her mother had been enslaved by the Vanloos, that her mother was white and her father of mixed African, Spanish and Cuban ancestry. Those contradictions have vexed historians, but they should also remind us that Mary was not living to make things convenient for future biographers. She spoke in rooms shaped by race and class, and unequal power to white reformers and black congregations and government men, and she may have been protecting relatives or testing a crowd or simply controlling how strangers were allowed to understand her. The contradictions don't erase her. They reveal how rarely she was ever permitted to tell her own story fully on her own terms, because nearly every surviving record of her was produced by someone else for their own purposes. The baptism register recorded ownership. The newspaper recorded an arrest. The church recorded a marriage. The spy network protected secrecy. The bureau recorded enrollment and salary disputes. Each institution preserved only the sliver of her it happened to need, which is why she looks like a different person in every document. She was larger than all of them combined. In June of 1867, she told the Bureau she had married and asked to be addressed as Mary J. R. Garvin, saying her husband had gone to Havana. She prepared to close the Georgia school and follow him to the West Indies. Then, weeks later, she signed a school report as Mrs. John L. Denman. Who Garvin was when Denman entered her life, whether a marriage collapsed or the names were shields, or the men were even the same man under different names. The documents don't say. For a long time, historians thought she simply vanished here in 1867. Then one more letter surfaced. It was written in October of 1870 from Greenwich Village in New York. The writer signed it M.J. Denman, and the handwriting, the references, and the relationship it described identify her, past reasonable doubt, as Mary Jane Richards. She was living in New York, working as a seamstress, thinking about going back to school so she could teach again. Money was tight, and Elizabeth Vanloo had recently sent her financial help. Mary thanked her for it. And then, gently but unmistakably, she asked Elizabeth not to send any more. She did not want to return to Richmond. She did not want to be pulled back into dependence on the Vanloo family. She wanted to live beyond their influence, to succeed by her own effort, under the name she had chosen for herself. That request quietly dismantles the most comforting version of this whole story, the one where Elizabeth Vanloo is the generous white liberator who discovered a brilliant slave girl and handed her a heroic destiny. Parts of that are real. Elizabeth did help educate her, did arrange her rescue from Liberia, did shield her after the Richmond arrest, did bring her into the network, did send money when she was struggling, but the same family had also legally claimed her as property. Her uncertain freedom, her schooling, her missionary path to Africa, all of it was shaped by Vanloo decisions made before Mary was old enough to choose anything. The relationship held real care and real control at the same time, real trust braided together with deep inequality. And her last surviving letter says, as plainly as she could put it, that gratitude was not the same as wanting to be owned by someone's kindness. She wanted to be more than Elizabeth Vanloo's former servant, former student, former agent. She wanted a life that didn't have to be explained through a white woman's household. History refused her that wish, and the way it refused her is the final cruelty of the story. After October of 1870, the record goes silent. We do not know whether she went back to school, whether she kept teaching, whether she stayed married, where she died, or where she is buried. Mary Jane Richards walks out of the archive and does not come back. Elizabeth Vanloo, meanwhile, remained. Her diary survived. Her letters were preserved. President Grant made her Richmond's postmaster. When she died in 1900, the newspapers retold the story of her Union loyalty. And it was in those deathbed accounts that a version of Mary first reached print. Described only as an unusually intelligent maid, the Vanloos had educated and placed in Davis's house. A decade later, in 1910, Elizabeth's niece, who had been a small child during the war, gave an interview and supplied a name she remembered: Mary Bowser. That interview ran in Harper's Monthly in 1911, and from it the legend was born. Then it grew. Later, writers added what the early sources never contained: the photographic memory, the alias Ellen Bond, the years-long disguise as a slow, ignorant servant, the plot to burn down the Confederate White House, a secret diary, thrown away by a descendant in the 20th century. Each edition made the story more cinematic and moved it further from the evidence. The photographic memory claim traces largely to recollections attached to a Richmond baker in the network, but the surviving document wasn't written during the war. The story passed down orally for generations before it was typed up in the 1950s. And historians have found it deeply unreliable. The Ellen Bond identity has no trustworthy basis. There's no evidence of the fire. The diary can't be verified and makes little sense. Keeping a written record of espionage inside Confederate Richmond would have been suicidal, and Mary had stopped using the Bowser name anyway. And then there was the photograph. For years, institutions printed an image said to show Mary Bowser, a composed black woman seated at a table looking straight at the camera. It appeared in news stories, in classrooms, in exhibits honouring military intelligence. Research eventually proved it was a different Mary Bowser, born decades later. The picture wasn't her. And that error revealed something about how badly we want our heroes to have faces. A famous spy should have a portrait. When the archive wouldn't provide one, someone supplied it. Anyway, and in doing so, replaced one unknown black woman with another. The legend was meant to honour Mary. It buried her instead. Notice what the myth chose to keep and what it chose to drop. It kept the photographic memory, the perfect disguise, the secret documents, the daring escape. A lone genius outwitting powerful men. Exceptional in a way that never once asked anyone to reconsider what ordinary black people were capable of. It let her be admired for fooling Jefferson Davis, without ever examining how the whole Confederacy depended on black people it refused to see. And it ended at the most comfortable possible moment. The Union wins, Richmond falls, the spy disappears. That way, no one had to hear her attack the Northern reformers. No one had to hear her demand the vote. No one had to follow her into an underfunded schoolhouse in Georgia or read her letters begging the Bureau for her wages and for protection from the men gathering outside. No one had to sit with the fact that a woman who risked her life for the United States could barely support herself once it had won. The real Mary didn't vanish because the important part of her life was over. She vanished because the country lost interest in black women the moment their stories stopped flattering its victory. Her work as a teacher may have reached more human beings directly than any paper she ever lifted from Davis's desk. She taught children who had become the first generation born outside slavery. She taught adults denied literacy their whole lives. She stood on stages and argued that freedom without citizenship was unfinished and that violence was already organizing against her people. And she was right. None of that was secret. All of it was forgotten anyway, because spying fits the shape history likes. One brave individual near powerful men, near important documents. Teaching asks you to look somewhere harder to dramatize. Crowded rooms, missing books, unpaid salaries, adults studying after a day of labour, children learning their letters while a mob gathers in the street. Less cinematic. Probably more important. She understood both kinds of resistance, because to her they were the same fight. During the war she used secrecy because openness would have gotten her killed. After it, she used a classroom because freedom had to become something people could actually practice. The education that let her gather intelligence was the same education she spent the rest of her life trying to give away. She moved through a dozen roles the world tried to fix on her. Enslaved child, colonization project, illegal free woman, servant, spy, teacher, lecturer, wife, seamstress, accepting each label just long enough to survive it, then trading it for another of her own making. Mary Jane Richards is the name closest to her early and wartime life. Mary Bowser came from a marriage and a child's memory. Richmondia Richards and Richmondia St. Pierre belonged to the lecturer. Mary Garvin and then M.J. Denman belonged to the woman trying to build a life beyond everyone who thought they'd made her. None of those names was false. Each was a moment. The mistake is believing the most famous one has to be the truest, because Mary Elizabeth Bowser, the name on the monuments and in the textbooks, became famous only because a white family member remembered it half a century after the war. Mary's own documents don't even establish Elizabeth as part of her name. History handed her a name she may never have used, pinned another woman's photograph beneath it, filled the silences of her life with stories she never told, and then congratulated itself for remembering her. She deserves a different kind of remembering, the kind honest enough to admit what it doesn't know. We don't know when or where she was born, who her parents were, the full truth of her freedom, every school she attended, or the real story of her marriages. We can't reconstruct every operation she ran or what she took from Davis's office, or what became of her after 1870. There is no verified portrait, and those blanks are not failures in the story. They are the story, because slavery kept better records of ownership than of the people it owned. Espionage demanded that evidence be destroyed. Black women's work was credited to the white people who organised it. Marriage and flight kept changing her name, and Reconstruction remembered its black teachers only as long as it was paying them. She wasn't lost in a single moment. Whole systems were built that made a woman like her impossible to keep, and still she remains, in a church register where a child was baptized and called property, in a ship's manifest carrying a 14-year-old toward Africa, in newspapers marvelling at an educated black woman jailed for claiming she was free, in a marriage record signed the day before Virginia left the Union. In Elizabeth Vanloo's morning question, "What news, Mary?" in the account of a woman going through Jefferson Davis's papers and talking her way past him when he caught her, in the reports of a lecturer demanding the vote, in school records from 3 states, in letters begging for a salary and for protection, and in one last message from Greenwich Village asking a powerful white woman politely to stop sending money, so that she could finally become no one's project but her own. Jefferson Davis looked at her inside his own house and saw only a black woman looking for work. The entire Confederacy made that same mistake on a national scale and lost a war partly because of it. Mary Jane Richards did not need a photographic memory to be dangerous. She only needed powerful men to believe she was incapable of understanding what she saw, and they always did. The legend gave her one name, one face, one impossible gift, one perfect mission. The truth gives us a woman who crossed every line her world drew for her, and who spent her whole life refusing to be what anyone else decided she was. They remembered the spy and forgot the teacher. They celebrated the servant in Jefferson Davis's mansion and overlooked the woman on a New York stage demanding the vote. They carved the name Mary Elizabeth Bowser into history. She signed her last letter M.J. Denman. History gave her a legend. She spent her life trying to give herself something better, her freedom and her own name.